Picture this. You stand in the shadows of the Forbidden City's innermost chambers, watching a 16-year-old boy emperor throw away his dragon robes. Tonight, he becomes someone else entirely. A merchant, a commoner, a hunter stalking prey through corridors lined with terrified servants. The silk hits marble with barely a whisper. Emperor Zhengde of the Ming Dynasty reaches for coarse peasant cloth, his eyes already gleaming with anticipation. Around him, eunuchs avert their gaze, knowing that what unfolds next will test the very limits of imperial power. You hear the rustle of fabric, the nervous breathing of concubines forced to play along with his twisted theatre. This isn't governance. This is something darker, more primal. The Son of Heaven has decided that absolute power means absolute indulgence, and tonight's performance will make seasoned courtiers weep with shame. The scent of incense cannot mask what's coming. Fear mingles with expensive perfumes as Zhengde's voice cuts through the silence, commanding his human dolls to assume their positions. This is the emperor who turned the Ming court into his personal stage, where every scene served his darkest appetites. But you cannot look away. None of them can. Because when an emperor decides that his subjects exist solely for his entertainment, resistance becomes treason, and survival demands participation in the unspeakable. Zhengde's transformation from crown prince to China's most depraved ruler began long before his coronation in 1505. The palace that raised him operated on whispers and shadows, where eunuchs wielded influence through manipulation, and young princes learned that power meant taking whatever they desired. His father, the Hongji emperor, had been everything Zhengde would never become. Devoted to one wife, dedicated to Confucian ideals, committed to responsible governance. When death claimed him at 36, it left 15-year-old Zhengde facing a choice between following his father's austere path or embracing intoxicating possibilities of absolute authority. Zhengde chose corruption with breathtaking enthusiasm. The coronation ceremony itself revealed glimpses of what was coming. While officials droned through ancient rituals, the new emperor's attention wandered to serving girls, to the curve of a dancer's neck, to possibilities that made his advisors shift uncomfortably. Power had awakened something in him that would soon consume everything it touched. Within months, the Forbidden City began its metamorphosis into something unprecedented in Chinese history. Traditional court protocols crumbled as Zhengde surrounded himself with actors, musicians, and most dangerously, the eunuch Liu Jin, whose whispered suggestions would fuel the emperor's darkest impulse. Zhengde's first recorded act of systematic depravity involved transforming imperial audiences into elaborate role-playing scenarios. He would dress as a common merchant, forcing high-ranking officials to kneel and beg for his fictional wares. The humiliation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate psychological torture disguised as imperial entertainment. Court records, heavily censored even then, hint at scenarios so degrading that Confucian scholars refused to document them fully. Zhengde would command ministers to crawl on hands and knees, barking like dogs while he decided their fates based on how convincingly they performed their assigned roles. The emperor's appetite for theatrical dominance soon expanded beyond mere humiliation. He began incorporating women into his performances, creating elaborate scenarios where concubines played helpless villagers while he portrayed various characters who would inevitably overpower and claim them. These weren't simple bedroom games. They were carefully choreographed displays of absolute control that could last for hours. Palace servants learned to recognize the signs of an approaching performance. Musicians would be summoned, costumes would appear, and then would come the selection process, where Zhengde would personally choose which officials and concubines would participate in that night's degrading spectacle. Those who pleased him in these twisted dramas found themselves elevated to positions of influence. Those who resisted or performed poorly faced exile, imprisonment, or worse. Zhengde had weaponized shame, turning the imperial court into a stage where survival depended on one's willingness to abandon dignity. Traditional imperial hunts involved pursuing deer or wild boar across carefully managed preserves. Zhengde perverted even this ancient practice, creating hunting expeditions where the prey walked on two legs and begged for mercy in languages he found amusing. The emperor would order raids on nearby villages, ostensibly searching for bandits or tax evaders. In reality, these expeditions served a darker purpose. Young women and men who caught his attention would be seized and transported to specially prepared hunting grounds within the imperial parks. What followed defied every principle of Confucian governance. Zhengde would release his human quarry into wooded areas, giving them a head start before pursuing them on horseback. The chase itself became a twisted form of foreplay, with capture leading to scenarios that court chroniclers could only describe in the most euphemistic terms. These hunts weren't isolated incidents. They became regular entertainment, with Zhengde inviting foreign dignitaries and important officials to witness his prowess as a hunter of human game. The psychological impact on participants was devastating, but the political implications were equally damaging. China's emperor was presenting himself to the world as a predator who viewed his subjects as entertainment. The logistics alone reveal the systematic nature of Zhengde's depravity. Special quarters were constructed for housing captured prey. Servants were assigned to maintain hunting costumes and equipment. Even the imperial kitchens were enlisted to provide refreshments for spectators who gathered to watch their emperor's grotesque performances. Perhaps no aspect of Zhengde's reign demonstrated his psychological manipulation more clearly than his merchant persona. The emperor would disappear from court for days at a time, emerging in common clothes to wander Beijing's markets and brothels, seeking victims who had no idea they were encountering the Son of Heaven. These expeditions allowed Zhengde to indulge his appetite for non-consensual encounters while maintaining plausible deniability. When women disappeared from markets or taverns, who would suspect the emperor? When families sought justice for missing daughters, their complaints would be dismissed as routine criminal matters. The merchant disguise also fed Zhengde's need for psychological dominance. He would seduce women by pretending to be a wealthy trader, promising marriage or financial security before revealing his true identity at the moment of conquest. The terror in their eyes when they realized they had been claimed by the emperor himself became another form of entertainment. Court eunuchs were commanded to facilitate these expeditions, providing safe houses, costumes, and alibis. They became accessories to imperial crimes, their complicity ensuring their silence. The entire apparatus of government was being corrupted to serve one man's sexual appetites, but the merchant persona served another purpose. It allowed Zhengde to gather intelligence on his subjects' true opinions of his rule. He would eavesdrop on conversations in taverns, learning which officials were plotting against him, which merchants were evading taxes, and which families harbored resentments that could threaten imperial authority. If you've made it this far, you're witnessing how absolute power corrupts absolutely. Type still watching below if you can stomach what comes next. The imperial harem had always been a symbol of the emperor's virility and power. Zhengde transformed it into something resembling a prison where hundreds of women existed solely for his entertainment and experimentation. Traditional concubines, selected for their beauty and family connections, found themselves sharing quarters with kidnapped peasants and foreign captives. Zhengde's method of acquiring new concubines abandoned all pretense of imperial dignity. He would personally inspect women brought to court, examining them like livestock, while making crude comments about their suitability for various purposes. Those who met his approval were immediately inducted into his collection, regardless of their existing marriages or family obligations. The emperor's treatment of his captive women revealed the depths of his sadistic creativity. He would force them to compete for his attention through increasingly degrading performances, promising freedom to winners while punishing losers with extended confinement or assignment to the most humiliating duties. Palace records suggest that Zhengde maintained detailed notes on each woman's responses to different forms of psychological and physical manipulation. He was conducting experiments in human degradation, treating his concubines as test subjects whose reactions informed his broader understanding of power and control. The harem's internal hierarchy reflected Zhengde's twisted psychology. Women who demonstrated enthusiasm for his games, even if that enthusiasm was clearly manufactured for survival, received better treatment and more luxurious accommodations. Those who maintained their dignity faced systematic efforts to break their spirits through isolation, humiliation, and worse. Traditional imperial guards served to protect the emperor and maintain order within the Forbidden City. Zhengde recruited his own personal force whose primary duty was facilitating and concealing his criminal activities. These weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. They were enablers and accomplices in imperial-scale depravity. The selection process for this private army prioritized moral flexibility over military competence. Zhengde sought men who would follow orders without question, regardless of how those orders violated law, tradition, or basic human decency. Many were criminals themselves, recruited from prisons with promises of wealth and imperial favor in exchange for absolute loyalty. Their duties included kidnapping operations, disguised as official arrests, maintaining secret facilities where victims were held before being presented to the emperor, and eliminating witnesses whose testimony could expose the true nature of Zhengde's activities. They operated with complete impunity, knowing that imperial authority protected them from any consequences. The private army also served as Zhengde's eyes and ears throughout Beijing and beyond. They identified potential victims, gathering intelligence on beautiful women or interesting men who might serve the emperor's appetites. Their reports helped him plan expeditions and select targets for his various forms of entertainment. Most disturbingly, these men became extensions of Zhengde's psychological manipulation. They would appear at victims' homes, claiming to represent various government agencies while actually serving the emperor's personal desires. The confusion and terror they created made resistance more difficult and escape nearly impossible. Funding Zhengde's elaborate depravities required enormous resources that he extracted from China's treasury with breathtaking audacity. Traditional imperial expenses like military campaigns and infrastructure projects were ignored, while vast sums disappeared into accounts controlled by his enablers and accomplices. The construction costs alone were staggering. Secret chambers, hunting facilities, specialized furniture, elaborate costumes, and secure transportation for victims required skilled craftsmen who were sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. The emperor's appetite for novelty meant these facilities were constantly being expanded and modified to accommodate his evolving tastes. Bribes and hush money represented another massive drain on imperial finances. Officials who witnessed Zhengde's activities, servants who helped facilitate his crimes, and families whose loved ones had been victimized all required payments to ensure their continued silence. The emperor was essentially purchasing the complicity of his entire government. Foreign observers began commenting on the stark contrast between China's official wealth and the empire's declining military capabilities. Resources that should have strengthened border defenses or improved agricultural systems were instead financing an emperor's personal entertainment complex hidden within the Forbidden City's walls. The economic impact extended beyond mere financial waste. Talented administrators who refused to participate in or enable Zhengde's activities found themselves removed from positions where they could serve the empire effectively. China was being governed by men whose primary qualification was their willingness to facilitate imperial crimes. Palace chroniclers faced an impossible dilemma. Their traditional duty was recording imperial activities for posterity, but Zhengde's behavior was so shocking that documenting it honestly would destroy the imperial system's legitimacy. Their solution was a conspiracy of silence that created one of history's most heavily censored official records. The surviving documents from Zhengde's reign reveal this censorship through their obvious gaps and euphemistic language. Activities are described as private entertainments or hunting expeditions, while victims are referred to as honored guests who participated in cultural exchanges with the emperor. Some scribes attempted to preserve evidence by developing coded language that future scholars might decipher. References to theatrical performances, costume changes, and hunting successes served as veiled descriptions of scenarios too explicit to record directly. These codes created a shadow history that hinted at truths too dangerous to speak openly. The most conscientious chroniclers simply refused to record certain events entirely, leaving blank pages or claiming illness prevented them from attending court sessions. Their absences created gaps in the official record that themselves became evidence of activities so shameful that trained historians could not bring themselves to document them. Years later, when scholars attempted to reconstruct Zhengde's reign, they found themselves working with fragments and implications rather than complete accounts. The Scribes Conspiracy had succeeded in protecting imperial dignity while preserving enough evidence for future generations to understand what had been deliberately concealed. High-ranking government officials found themselves trapped between their duty to serve the emperor and their desperate attempts to preserve some semblance of personal dignity. Zhengde delighted in forcing these proud, educated men to participate in scenarios that mocked everything they claimed to represent. The morning audiences, traditionally formal occasions where important state business was conducted, became opportunities for the emperor to humiliate his ministers through elaborate role-playing games. Officials would arrive prepared to discuss tax policy or military campaigns, only to be commanded to dress as servants and perform menial tasks, while Zhengde made crucial decisions based on how convincingly they degraded themselves. Some ministers attempted to resist by claiming illness or family emergencies to avoid court appearances. Zhengde responded by sending his private guards to escort them personally, making it clear that absence would be interpreted as treason. The emperor had weaponized attendance, turning the simple act of showing up to work into participation in his twisted theater. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who had spent decades building reputations for wisdom and integrity found themselves barking like dogs or crawling on hands and knees while foreign ambassadors watched in horror. The emperor wasn't just entertaining himself, he was systematically destroying the credibility of his own government. Those who maintained their composure despite these humiliations earned Zhengde's particular attention. He would devise increasingly elaborate scenarios specifically designed to break their spirits, treating their resistance as a personal challenge that made eventual victory more satisfying. The true horror of Zhengde's reign wasn't found in any single act of depravity, but in the systematic way he destroyed everyone around him. The Forbidden City became a machine for breaking human spirits, where survival required abandoning every principle that made life worth living. Servants learned to anticipate the emperor's moods by observing subtle signs that preceded his most creative cruelties. A certain smile meant someone would be selected for humiliation. Particular clothing choices signaled the beginning of elaborate role-playing scenarios. Even his eating habits became omens that palace inhabitants learned to interpret for their own survival. The cumulative effect created an atmosphere of constant terror disguised as imperial grandeur. Beautiful women lived in luxury, while knowing they could be selected for degrading performances at any moment. Government officials enjoyed tremendous formal authority, while understanding that their real job was entertaining a madman. Servants received generous wages for work that violated every moral principle they possessed. Children born within the palace walls grew up accepting this environment as normal, their development twisted by exposure to systematic cruelty disguised as imperial tradition. They learned to smile while witnessing atrocities, to applaud while watching dignified adults reduced to whimpering animals, to treat human degradation as routine entertainment. The palace had become a breeding ground for the kind of moral corruption that would eventually destroy the Ming Dynasty itself. Zhengde wasn't just indulging his personal appetites. He was creating a generation of officials and servants whose understanding of power had been fundamentally warped by their participation in his crimes. The secret that scribes refused to record, the practice so obscene it could only be whispered about in the darkest corners of the Forbidden City, involved Zhengde's treatment of captured enemy soldiers. Rather than executing them honorably or ransoming them according to military tradition, he incorporated them into elaborate death games that combined sexual humiliation with public execution. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They entertained the emperor and his inner circle while demonstrating his absolute power over life and death. They terrorized potential enemies by showing that capture meant something worse than death. Most importantly, they provided Zhengde with the ultimate expression of dominance over men trained to fight and die with honor. The games themselves defied description, combining elements of gladiatorial combat with sexual degradation and ritualized torture. Participants were forced to compete for the emperor's amusement, with winners receiving temporary reprieve and losers facing increasingly creative forms of execution. The audience included high-ranking officials who were required to applaud and cheer as if watching legitimate entertainment. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these spectacles returned home with accounts that damaged China's international reputation for centuries. The Son of Heaven, supposedly the earthly representative of cosmic order, was presenting himself as a sadistic monster who treated human beings as disposable toys for his personal amusement. Zhengde's death in 1521 came not from assassination or popular uprising, but from the gradual collapse of a body weakened by 16 years of relentless indulgence. His final months were spent in increasing paranoia as he realized that his crimes had made him enemies of nearly everyone who knew the truth about his reign. The immediate aftermath revealed the true extent of the damage. The treasury was bankrupt, the military was demoralized, and the entire imperial government had been corrupted by years of participating in or enabling imperial crimes. China's enemies had grown stronger, while its ruler played games with human lives. The new emperor and his advisors faced an impossible task. They had to restore imperial dignity while concealing the full extent of Zhengde's depravity from both the Chinese people and foreign observers. The official histories were sanitized, the surviving victims were silenced, and the physical evidence was systematically destroyed. But the psychological damage proved impossible to erase. Officials who had spent years facilitating imperial crimes struggled to return to legitimate governance. Servants who had witnessed systematic cruelty found it difficult to trust authority. The entire imperial system had been contaminated by Zhengde's reign, creating weaknesses that would eventually contribute to the Ming Dynasty's collapse. The question remains, when absolute power meets absolute corruption, can any institution survive the combination? Zhengde's legacy suggests that some forms of moral rot are too deep to heal. some violations of human dignity too fundamental to forgive. His reign stands as history's most disturbing example of what happens when a single individual's darkest impulses become the organizing principle of an entire civilization. And somewhere in Asia, another ruler was already beginning to walk a similar path toward absolute depravity.